Hello everybody, my name is Vadim and I'd like to represent you CSS Grid Layout. It's the most powerful layout system available in CSS. Grid layout excels at dividing a page into major regions or defining the relationship in terms of size, positions, and layer. Like tables, Grid CSS layout enables to align elements into columns and rows. However, it's made easier with the help of CSS Grid. When we work with CSS Grid, you can apply CSS rules to parent element and children. Let's have a look at some properties for the container grid. First of all, we need to declare a grid container. How can we do it? The property display grid generates a block grid. Then the second property display inline grid, which generates a block inline element. Defining an explicit grid. There are several properties: grid template columns, grid template rows, and grid template areas. Grid template rows determines the number of rows and determine the height of them. Grid template columns sets the number of columns and determines the width of them. The grid template areas property defines named grid areas. Let's look at the values of these properties. First of them, FR, it's a fraction of the free space in the grid. We can say also that it's a unit of length that allows you to create flexible elements. The CSS repeat function presents a repeating section of track list, allowing you to write a large number of columns and rows in a compact form. We can combine these two properties in one property, grid template. First, we write the value of property grid template rows, and then the value of grid template columns. The next value which we can apply percentage dimensions. Percentage dimensions are calculated from the width or height of the grid container. We can use also pixel. It's a non-flexible units. We can write the rows, the size of the rows and the size of the columns in pixels. The min-max function defines a size range greater than or equal to min and less than or equal to max. The fair values can only be set as a maximum. The next value, grid template areas. Grid template areas property defines named grid areas. The property syntaxes provides visualization of the grid structure, making it easier for understanding. Align content along the horizontal axis. Let's look at the next property, justify content. Justify content start aligns the grid to the left side of the container. The opposite value is end. Justify content end aligns the grid to the right of the container. Justify content center, as you may have already guessed, aligns the content in the center of the container. Justify content stretch resizes the grid items to allow the grid fill the full width of the grid container. Justify content space between makes equal space between elements, non-margins. Justify content space around also make equal space between elements, but it makes half size margins. Justify content space evenly makes equal space between elements and full size margins. Let's look at the next property of aligning the grid along the vertical axis. Is align content. Align content start is the default value, aligns the content to the top of the container. Align content end is the opposite value that aligns the content to the bottom of the container. Align content center, as you may have already guessed, aligns content in the center of the container. Align content stretch resizes the grid elements to allow the grid to fill the full height of the grid container. Align content space between sets equal space between elements, non-margins. Align content space around makes equal size between elements and half size margins. Align content space evenly makes equal size between elements and half size margins. Let's look at the property of aligning grid items along the horizontal axis. Property justify items applies to all grid items inside the container. The default value of this property stretch that fills the whole width of the cell. Justify item start aligns content to the left side of the cell. The opposite value is end, aligns the content to the right of the cell. Justify item center aligns the content in the center of the cell. Align the grid items along the vertical axes. The property align items. The first value of this property stretch, also default value, align grid items resizes the grid items to allow the grid fill the full height of the grid container. Align item start aligns the content to the top of the cell, to the top of the cell. And line items end is the opposite value, aligns content to the bottom of the cell. And the properties, the value of the property align items center aligns content in the center of the cell. Let's look at the properties grid column gap, grid row gap. That property specifies the size of the grid lines. You can think about it like setting the width of the space between the columns and rows. There are some notes. The grid prefix will be removed and grid columns gap and grid row gap renamed to the column gap and row gap. The gutters are only created between the columns and rows, not on the outer edges. We have shortland. First we write the grid row gap, then the value of grid column gap. If you want to set the same spacing between column elements and rows, you can write gap and one value. The properties for the grid, for the item grid, there are properties like justify self, which has values start, end, center, stretch. There are also property align cell. There is also property align self. The value of it start, end, center, and stretch. Defining and placing grid, there are some values grid outer columns, grid outer rows, and grid outer floors. For more detailed information, please visit this website. Thank you very much for attention.